everybody, and welcome to another episode of Horrifically Horrifying, presented by the HCA. My name is Heather Wixson. I am one of your co-hosts, and I am joined, as always, by my other co-host, Kevin Taft. Say hello, Kevin.
Hello, how are you?
Good, good. I'm really excited about this week's episode. We have a fun interview coming up with one of I would say, the new voices in horror. Keith, you're sitting here. Let's go ahead and introduce you because you're
Sure.
just kind of awkwardly here, and it's not like an introduction and like an award show or anything, but we're so glad to have you here, Keith. So first of all, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Excellent. So both Kevin and I were really big fans of The Vigil, which is why we wanted to have you come in and do this episode with us. So first of all, thank you so much for taking time and congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. No, it's really exciting that it's getting out there finally and getting a good response so far.
I'm looking at your movies and the sites. Obviously, you're a genre fan, and we are all horror all the time here. So I was curious if we usually sort of chat about some of the stuff that we've seen recently, and I'm curious if you've seen anything fun lately.
Yeah, no, I think so. I've seen a bunch. I'm always kind of devouring movies, both kind of new and just either stuff I haven't seen in a long time or new to me that are older films. I really liked Relic this year. Saint Maud is really great, and Saint Maud I've seen many times, weirdly enough, because it premiered the same week as The Vigil at Toronto, and then we kind of did some of the festival tour together. So Saint Maud was playing at a lot of the same places. It's a great film, and seeing it again is always wonderful. So those are some recent ones. I've got a ton here that I just I'm always picking off the shelf and kind of rewatching things from, like, there's a Spanish series of films from the 70s that I love called the Blind Dead films that are about these shriveled mummy kind of zombie-like horseback riding kind of conquistador guys who have no eyes, who are the blind dead, and they hunt by sound. And it's this really they're interesting kind of Euro B movies, but they have this great sort of setup where someone will end up at an old castle or whatever it is, and the blind dead will rise. Literally, their horses come up out of the graves, and they'll ride around, and they'll kind of creep into a building, and they'll just be listening because they can't see you. They'll be listening, and then if they get you, they eat you. So stuff like that. I love stuff like that.
That's amazing. I actually wrote a note because I'm really curious about this.
Yeah,
and
I
I
am
hadn't
too.
heard of it. Is that is that through sort of one of the specialty distribution
There was
channels?
a box set. I don't know who put that out. Maybe Synapse or something, or maybe Blue Underground. There was a box set a long time ago. I think some of them are now coming out on Blu-ray. I don't know who has the rights to them. And I think there's some on streaming. There's like 4 or 5 of these films. But yeah, The Blind Dead, they're a lot of fun.
Interesting. I love that you mentioned Relic too, because when I was watching this, and maybe you can speak to this or not, but I think what's really interesting is that we're sort of in this phase of horror these days where we're getting more mature stories. And as I was watching this and rewatching it, one of the movies that sort of popped up where I was like, oh, this would pair really well with is Relic. And I was a big fan of Natalie Erica Christian's debut, because that was at Sundance 2020. And another movie I thought of, and I don't know if you've seen it, is The Dark and the Wicked.
I haven't seen The Dark and the Wicked yet.
It's
It's on my list. It's on my list.
Yeah, it's one of Kevin's favorites, I know, from last year, and one of mine as well. But it's really interesting that I maybe we're sort of at an age, a lot of us, where we're kind of dealing with sort of these things that maybe in our 30s and earlier we weren't really ready to confront. And I'm a big fan of where sort of the horror movement is heading, because I think there's a lot to talk about in terms of how we process grief and guilt and things like that. And I don't think previously we've all done it sort of in healthy ways. And I like that horror sort of become this avenue to sort of work out those demons per se, or so to speak. So I think that's really interesting. But I think there's a lot of really lovely things about this movie that I very much enjoyed. Particularly that hallway scene was just
Yeah, no, I think
So true.
horror's gotten to a really interesting place, certainly in the last 10 years, where it's kind of become I think it always has been to a certain extent, but it's certainly now more than ever recognized as a genre where people can explore things that are a little more out of the box, both either from like culturally specific lenses or kind of getting into some of this underlying stuff, like certain themes, about tragedy or guilt or, fear. In ways that aren't just kind of the typical sort of scares that you expect or those sorts of things. It feels like it's the genre you can play around in most because, in a lot of ways, I think horror fans, um, they're adventurous, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's a roller coaster, and they like that, and they like the pushing of the buttons and kind of exploring these things. So you see films like Get Out, where you can really get into social stuff and psychological stuff through the lens of horror, and you can find a large audience, and that's awesome. I am excited to see kind of where that'll go even more.
Absolutely. And I wanted to ask real quick, just to kind of kick things off and let our viewers know a little bit about who you are.
Mhm.
Can you talk a little bit sort of making the jump from shorts to features? Because this is your first feature, which I'm highly impressed by. And I'd love to hear a little bit sort of about your journey in terms of, going from Arcane a few years ago into the Vigil, a few years later.
Yeah, so I definitely have kind of one of a weird journey in that this is like my third career. It's I didn't start off thinking in terms of like after high school thinking I would be a filmmaker. I studied film in college, but it was not film production. It was like film criticism. It
Mm.
was European film, mostly Italy and German film. That was, like what I was doing as minor. But I was pre-med, majored in English, and then kind of went on this journey of trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life, which led me to rabbinical school, where I'm not a rabbi, but I did a master's in education and learned a lot of the theology that's in the Vigil, and then ended up in clinical research where I worked in nursing homes with a lot of
Oh, wow.
people with dementia, which also found its way into the Vigil. Um, it's interesting because I always kind of had this idea of a career, medical school and working in medicine, that I always found I was balancing with the kind of creative impulses that I had, which found their expression in writing first. So it was books and then screenplays. And I wrote screenplays for about 8 years while I had a day job. And some of them I sold. None of them were ever made into anything, but I learned the ropes. And I got to a point where I felt like I finally figured out what my voice was. And then I could try to take a stab at filmmaking. So, with Arcane, my short film, it was, I convinced my wife to let me use our savings. And I just embarked on this kind of crazy
Mm.
endeavor of, you know, uh, jump right into the Fire Film School where I wrote, produced, and directed Arcane, and it was just kind of learning every bump of the road. And for 5 months or whatever, I just immersed myself in that. I was pretty happy with how it turned out, in terms of first stab at something, and luckily it was seen by enough people that I was able to get the Vigil off the ground. And it was kind of like that was the thing that convinced them, like, okay, yeah, we'll let him do this. I had actually, after I'd written the Vigil, I'd been approached by companies who wanted to buy it and not let me direct it.
Mm.
And while those offers were tantalizing, I turned them down because I thought I'm going to find somebody who will give me money to make this. And luckily enough, I did.
What drew you to this particular genre?
You know, I don't know. I think it's just a dark streak. It just goes way back. It's just kind of a morbid, I don't know, fascination. Um, even as a little kid, I remember distinctly, right, discovering Lovecraft and reading Poe and just getting a visceral thrill out of it. Edward Gorey. It's just this kind of dark stuff just appealed to me. Um, and then, in my teens, it was my goth phase. It was just very much like that was my world, right? I was, uh, first in line when the Crow opened because all the best bands, and just look at this sort of goth world they created. And it's just always been, that's just kind of been my fascination. And so when it came time to actually make a film, it's interesting. As a screenwriter, I'd written lots of different genres, big sci-fi things, and like teen drama kind of things, and some horror. But when it came time to like, okay, well, like, what's my actual voice? Like, if I'm were to make a film, what would it be? It was definitely horror.
Interesting.
By the way, when you said The Crow and you talked about all the bands, it just flashed me back to like the 90s and
Yeah.
that wave of amazing soundtracks that we had back then. I don't think we
Yeah.
realized like how good we had it. And it makes me
Yeah,
sad
we
we don't
did.
get that these days that much.
Mm-mm.
No, you don't see those kind of compilation soundtracks where you get where bands nowadays. It feels like it's kind of music plucked from albums that's kind of curated for a soundtrack. But back then, the bands were actually writing for the film,
Yep.
which is a lot of fun.
Yeah, I was like, I remember, was it Last Action Hero that did the rap acts with the rock bands? I'm trying to remember or if that was
There was-
Judgment Night. I can't remember.
Yeah, Judgment Night had that, and then I think also didn't. Oh, there was a comic book one that had that as well. It's I'm blanking on the name of it right now, but yeah, that you used to get those mashups, right, where you get you'd either be like a hard rock band or like a metal band and then a rapper or something. Those were always fun.
Those were the days. If there's anybody who's like in their 20s right now watching this, they're going to be
You're
like,
right, they're
"What
gonna
are
have
these
no
guys
idea what
talking
we're talking about. Yeah. Old people.
Sorry, kids, get off our lawn. So I want to talk about Dave in this movie because he's so good and he really is the heart of this story. And like 90% of this movie, maybe even 95, is really hinging on him. And I was going to talk a little bit sort of working with him and going into this character who obviously is carrying a lot of guilt and a lot of grief with him, and how that sort of ends up working its way into the situation that he finds himself in here. Because I think it's just a really lovely sort of, I don't know if chamber piece is the right way to say it, but it's a really interesting sort of one-man show for a lot of it.
Yeah, and that was something that I told my producers pretty early when they were like, okay, let's look at locations for the movie. And I was like, well, we're going to be in Brooklyn, so we're going to have some of the street and some of that. Most of it's going to be in this house, and so it's really important we find the exact house. But the third location is the most important. That's Dave's face. And so it was really important to me to find that actor. It's hard when you're writing a script not to put yourself in it. So for me, it was kind of my own emotion and just kind of whatever, my own past, and just dealing with a lot of the stuff that I kind of poured into it. And like, how are you going to find someone who can embody that and kind of and get it? And I was just really lucky in finding Dave. Dave, is an amazing character actor who's appeared in lots of things. He was in True Detective and The Walking Dead and Logan, and he's very chameleon-like. If you see him in any of these things, like Logan, for example, he looks very different.
Yeah.
But it was just the way in which he was able to express a lot with very little in terms of the movement of his face and no words. And for me, that was really, really important. If you're alone in a house, technically alone in a house, how are you going to show all this stuff that's brewing inside of him? And that even more that this thing that's in the house with him is pulling out of him, that's trying to evoke. And so Dave was able to just kind of capture this raw sort of emotional intensity. It's interesting when you talk to Dave about it, he talks about how hard it was. It was a very hard shoot for him, not just the sort of indie filmmaking stuff of everyone piled together in a house and just the difficulty of filming night after night after night after night, but just the emotional well that he had to pull from. It's interesting. I remember distinctly, there's a scene where he's kind of awakens in the chair, having been outside the house for a bit, and he has this breakdown. And that breakdown for Dave, he of course knew about it, and we had been planning on kind of what that was going to be like. But when it came, it was very cathartic. It was this kind of moment of like, I can finally it's hard to live on a set in fear, and find yourself in fear and kind of create that emotion. So that was a very cathartic moment. And I remember I mean, he really nailed it on the first take. But of course, I was like, let's do it again. And he was like, really? Um, but yeah, he's a very powerful performer.
Can you talk about the sound design a little bit? Because that really impressed me. Because you didn't see a lot all the time, but you have definitely heard stuff.
Yeah, and that was, it comes from a bunch of different directions. One of which was I knew we were in a very contained space, and the sound design was going to be really important. And I just growing up, whenever I'd watch horror films, I remember plugging my ears and being like, oh, the scariness is reduced by half instantly. And so it's just, that's how crucial sound is in these things. And then when you're constructing a scare, obviously when you're on set shooting something that's scary, it is the least scary thing you've ever seen. It looks ridiculous. But you're trying to build it. You're already in the editing room trying to figure out how you're building this scene and what this looks like. And sound just plays such a huge role. So we just spent a ton of time on it. I was lucky that in post we had a lot of time to not only work with Michael Yezierski, the composer, in terms of the score and how that was going to fit in, but I really wanted to give this house a life of its own. And it goes back to the kind of alien idea of when you only get bits and pieces of something, your mind creates a vision much more frightening than when you actually see the final thing. So sound works the same way, where you're hearing bits of pieces. It's always great, I find, that when you hear something that feels out of place in a familiar environment, like you can start building on that and use that. So that's what it was. It was just kind of finding those sounds. The house creaks. What are the creaks going to be like? How do they function? How are the sounds moving, and what are they building towards? And then as the night goes on, getting into more and more unnatural sounds and kind of just layering that stuff and really leaning into it. I wanted it so that you could, some people are, instead of closing, plugging their ears, they'll close their eyes during scary scenes. I wanted that not to work. I wanted it so if you close your eyes, it would be even worse, because then you'd be hearing, this stuff.
Excellent. You mentioned the house, which I do think also sort of becomes a character in this movie as well. And I was curious, when you found that location, like how much of it was as is, and then how much did you guys have to go in and dress it and really set that mood? Because it really, when you go into that house, there's like an oppressive feeling that you feel, where it's like this weight that's just on you, and you just feel it, and basically up until the end of the movie once you're out.
Yeah, I mean, that was just another amazing kind of piece of synchronicity, much like Finding Dave was that house. So in the script, when I wrote the script, I had a layout in my head, and I'd drawn it in terms of like, where are the stairs, where's he sitting, where's the other rooms. And then when I storyboarded the film before we went and location scouted, I was amazed when I looked at those storyboards to this house that it really fit. It was smaller than I envisioned, but that actually was good for the claustrophobia. It was a real house in Brooklyn. It was owned, it still is, by one of the executive producers of the movie. It was a house that he was going to flip and remodel for his family. And we moved into it several months after the elderly woman who lived there had passed away. And when I walked into it and I visited, I think the first time I visited it was at night, which was important to me. I was like, I got to see what this place looks, how dark it gets. We're in Brooklyn, so how dark is it going to actually get? And it got really dark. But the carpeting, the drapery, those we left. Those are all the same. The house was empty, except I think that dining room table is the same table. So I don't know. I just really do believe there is a certain, I'm not a superstitious person, but I do believe in, like, there's a feeling and there's something baked into the walls. If someone's lived in a house for like 80 years, there's going to be something in that house in terms of like just the feel of it, that this was an inhabited place. And I really wanted that. I didn't want to build a set for this. So once we got in there and we saw the layout matched kind of what I was going for, and then we felt it. It was right. We were like, yeah, this is the spot. And so then we had to dress it and kind of make it the Hasidic home that it is, as authentically as we could. But once we had that, there was definitely a feeling in there, even though it was a nice shoot and it was fun. Everyone had we all worked very hard, but everyone was happy to be there. There was a sort of atmosphere in that house that is gone now since it's been removed, but I guess we captured it in the movie.
Wasn't there, so forgive me if I'm wrong about this, because I remember it really affected me the first time. Second time, my TV was kind of dark, but isn't there a painting behind him a lot?
Mhm.
And that freaked me out the whole time. And I was texting a friend who also was watching it at the same time. And I was like, the painting's freaking me out. Something's going on. And he's like, me too.
Yeah, there's a painting that's just behind the chair that he's sitting in. That's like of a rabbi reading a book or praying or something, like an old guy. And it's an interesting. So in the film, the actress who plays Sarah, who he texts and calls with, who we meet at the beginning, she actually painted that painting. She did a lot of the paintings that are in the house. She's a fascinating person, and that she comes from that community and kind of left the community much like Yaakov did, and has built a life for herself in the secular world. And part of it is as an artist and making these paintings. And yeah, so when we were going through all her paintings, she brought them all over and we were putting them around the house. I was like, that one's really great, because especially if we're low and kind of looking up at Dave in the chair, that one's kind of brooding and looking behind.
Yep.
It just creates an atmosphere of, and it's funny, as we were shooting it, I toyed in my head with the idea of, like, could we move that? Could we make it move? Like, could we do something with it? But I thought, no, let's just let it be there. It'll be just doing its thing in the low light.
Yeah. And it was super effective for it to, I kept on expecting something to happen. with
Something to happen with it.
it. But it kept, it made me constantly uncomfortable, which is
Yeah.
effective for sure.
Yeah.
I wanted to mention, because I know we're already getting kind of close to like the winding down part of this, but I want to talk about Lynn Cohen in this,
Mhm.
because she's not in a ton of it, but her presence is very much a part of what's going on in the film. And I know sadly she passed away about a year ago, which is very
Mhm.
sad. Can you talk a little bit sort of working with her, and kind of, it's interesting because a lot of times when you see Alzheimer's represented on screen, it's sort of represented as this very one note kind of
Mhm.
experience. And I like the fact you mentioned that you'd worked,
Mm.
in a nursing home. I actually did that too. When I was like 19, I worked doing like billing and stuff and got to know
Sure.
a lot of the residents. And I've really found that, when somebody says Alzheimer's, it's not just this one singular thing. Like, it's very much sort of this broad spectrum of things that
Mhm.
people could be dealing with.
Yeah, I mean, working with Lynn was amazing. She has just she had this storied career of just, obviously Sex of the City, and then Munich, and just stuff, just, going all the way back. And she brought all that with her. When she showed up, she was like, she was ready to go, because, she had just had so much experience. It was interesting too for this film. I remember meeting with her. We had dinner before the shoot when we were in pre-production, and I was like, talking to her about it, and she'd read the script. And interestingly enough, she saw her grandmother a lot in this role. And in fact, the accent she's doing in the film is her grandmother's voice, her immigrant grandmother. And a lot of it was very personal. There's a moment where she talks about a pogrom in Europe in which her family, people were killed, and that is true to both my history and her own. So there was a lot of kind of very personal in it with her, but she's also just the sweetest. She was tiny, very short. Dave's almost like, if he's not 6 feet, he's very close. To see the two of them together, like this big, but she was a powerhouse.
Yeah.
Just this powerhouse but also incredibly humble. She'd always, the things that she told Dave all the time is, the most important person in the scene is the other actor. Always, it's the other actor. And I just remember, just she had that way about her. And then in terms of, like, the dementia and kind of showing that, you're right. From my experience, working for years and, doing a drug study in nursing homes, I had firsthand experience in watching a lot of people decline, kind of, and seeing the initial stages of dementia, and then seeing the final stages, and kind of seeing how a person's mind kind of unravels, and how a personality can crumble. And so that was stuff that I'd written into the script, and then talking with Lynn about it, and kind of, just figuring out how we were going to make it function in that so it looked as realistic as possible, in terms of, right, not one note, not just, oh, they don't remember anything, or oh, they're kind of acting crazy. But it's more that, the lucid moment comes and goes. There's lots
Yeah.
of moments, and the trick in this movie is, when is she lucid? Like, how do we
Right.
know? Because the things she's talking about, like what's real, what isn't real, and then if it's supernatural, what is she aware of? What does she know?
Mhm.
Absolutely. Kevin, do you have anything else before we wrap up?
I'm good. I will say that um, the ending of the movie, the very ending,
Mm-hmm.
that was on purpose, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Because it was one of those, I was I was watching and then I kind of didn't pay attention for a second. Then I was like,
Mm.
oh. And then I sit there watching it. I'm like, is this what I think it is? All right, so good. It's good. I'm gonna leave
Yeah,
it
no, and
here.
I wanted to keep it ambiguous, and it's interesting because I can't tell you how many. I was lucky before the lockdown that I was able to see the film with audiences,
Mhm.
as we did some festivals and stuff, and it's amazing to me how many different reactions there are to kind of that ending. There's some people who I think get right away what I was intending. There are other people who don't even see anything. They're
Wow.
just like, why are we just still sitting here? They don't see anything, like literally nothing. um it was funny, a little anecdote about that scene is, towards the beginning of the end of that scene, we're bringing the body out of the house and it's being put into the mortuary van. And weirdly enough, that morning when we were filming that, a real mortuary van was driving down the street and saw the body coming out and thought that it was a pickup that they were meant to do or something. It was just totally bizarre. Yeah.
Oh
So
my
weird.
gosh. That is
Mhm.
that is crazy. Thank God they didn't like show up and like ruin the shot and everything.
Right. Right. I
We'll
know.
take it.
It's funny because in the film you can, if you pay very close attention, you can see the car stop and kind of watch. You're just really seeing their tail lights because it's out of focus, but it was just, yeah, just a weird moment.
That's funny.
Yeah.
Weird synchronicity between fact and
Yes.
fiction there. Well, Keith, thank you so much for being here
Thank
today
you.
to talk about the Vigil. It's been a real pleasure. And for those of you watching at home, the Vigil comes out this Friday from IFC midnight. I highly recommend it. Make sure you turn the lights off and get ready and turn it up loud because you're going to have a really fun time. But Keith, again, thank you so much. And hopefully you're slated to, are you doing Firestarter next?
I
I
am.
saw
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Right.
That is
Yeah.
amazing.
It's exciting. It's going to be a lot of fun.
That's so cool.
Mm.
Well, thank you.
Good
That's
job.
amazing, and I'm so excited for you. And hopefully, we can have you back to talk little Stephen King then too.
Yeah, that would be fun. Definitely. Well, look,
Wonderful,
I had a great time. This was a lot
really
of fun.
excellent. Thank you so much for joining us. And for
Yep.
those of you watching home, thanks so much for tuning in. And we'll see you next week.